Welcome, everyone, again to another edition of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am your host and also the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. And today we're talking about something that continues to make news every day, the continuing strike in Hollywood. And for that, we've got a very special guest. Odell Mitchell III is an entertainment lawyer, also practices intellectual property law, business law with thirdinlinelegal.com. Odell, thank you for joining us on the SERMAPod.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rich. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to chatting.
So we're dealing with two strikes here. One is the writer's strike, which is now into about day 120. And the actor strike is well into about day 50 or so. So before we get into some of the reasons that this labor issue is continuing, perhaps you could explain to our listeners and viewers what some of the key issues the strike is all about. We know that this is being called the Netflix strike in many regards. So what issues are streaming presenting and what issues overall are driving this labor issue?
Yeah, sure. So certainly there are kind of a few foundational issues that tend to be coming up. And so you have your couple of unions on one side and, your studios and the large streamers on the other side, if we're putting it fairly simply. And so some of the issues that really come up, especially for the talent side, so like our writers and our actors, is concerned about streaming. And then also concern about AI, and then from the writer's standpoint, also kind of the writing process. When it comes to streaming, one of the big things that comes into play that people probably, even if you're not following this really closely, like a word that comes up a lot is the word residuals. And so a big part of what is at issue is the amount of residuals that talent is paid whenever it comes to things that are streamed. So there's that's being decided, and that is something that has been significantly decreased, or it's very low in the streaming area compared to what it has been in the past. So that's one of the big ones that comes up when it comes to streaming, and then just the contention around those pieces. So that's just a really general way of looking at it, but we can dive into nitty gritty if you want to. That's a general way of looking at that streaming piece.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, a lot of people have frequently heard of residuals, but probably not many understand what that term is. Could you explain a little more? What is a residual and who is eligible for those? Many of us have heard, for example, you might get a check for a couple bucks in the mail every time your movie is shown. Is that how it works? And why is that such a big issue here? And also given the way production and content is now being developed, why residuals are a smaller piece of the financial pie.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is very similar to a lot of things that you see in various kinds of entertainment. So, one of the places that I'm also very key involved is music. So a lot of times people hear the term royalty. It's not that they're exactly the same thing, but it's a similar idea. The idea being that something has been created and then it's being presented to the world, it's being exploited, people are enjoying it, but it's being enjoyed many times over as opposed to just the one time it's been created. And so then there is this residual income that comes in. And so, for example, if someone puts out a movie or they put out a TV show and it's presented, then the idea being that the platform or the network that puts that out and what it's coming from, they're generating continuous income off of the audience's interaction with that. And a small portion of that income should be going to those who created it. And that goes as residual. So if I was a writer, maybe I wrote on a show and it's a hit show, if we were all lucky enough to write on like Seinfeld or something like that, then it's a hit show. And as it continues to live in the world, the idea being that, you do get that check in the mail, or you get that little bit of money that comes from every time it's viewed or presented or something along those lines. And those are at issue.
How has that changed? What's the residual issue that they're currently fighting about?
Yeah, so in the past, it's not that it's ever been so great especially for writers. Like the main people who are in the thrust of it right now is the writers union. So it's not like it's ever been so great. Like people really need to understand that even if you were a well-known or a successful writer on a show or in movies, and there aren't very many writers that are really known by name outside of Hollywood. But even if you were doing really well, that still largely is a middle-class socioeconomic existence, so it's not like people are making tons and tons of money as a writer on even a hit show. So it's never been something that is like just a massive amount of money for folks, because it tends to be a small portion of it. But it has been both a larger percentage in the past, and then also more easily measurable, because we'd be looking at clear network numbers. So when a show comes out and we'd have our seasons, and then the networks will be publishing their numbers through SoundScan or things like that, so that they could see those stats very heavily, or sales of mechanical stuff. So like DVDs that would go out, or how many tickets are sold at a movie, or things along those lines. These days, streaming, one of the reasons that issue is that the streaming, the stats around it are not as transparent. The studios, the streamers, they don't share that information in a clear and transparent way with the unions. And also, the numbers are way higher. I mean, the ability for there to be more people watching a show, even a niche show, millions of people, like so much more viewership happens there. And so the idea being that if you're a writer on a show, you have way more people watching your show that you wrote on, and thus it is a much bigger hit or reaches more people. But the percentage of residual that's coming to writers is like pennies on the dollar these days comparatively. And so they can't put together the living that they would, even though they're doing the same work or even more work than they had been in the past.
So it's interesting that you talk about numbers, because it's obviously hard to quantify some of those viewerships today versus back in the Nielsen days, when you have a more accurate reflection. These days, it's far more important to log in how many minutes a program on the streamers is being viewed. But how does that play into what you're talking about?
Yeah, it is. And so that's part of the challenge that makes it tough, is that there isn't as much of a standard, to do so. Like you said, kind of back in the Nielsen days, there might be more of a standard, and there also, it had to be clear. These days, each of the streamers kind of has their way that they're calculating what their viewership is. Sometimes people are measuring it by the amount of views that are there. You see a lot of times the amount of minutes that something is streamed. Like, that's a thing that comes up a lot. This was, viewed 1 billion minutes or something along those lines. And so sometimes the amount of time that it is, which certainly makes sense, because we also know that the way that it was before, we could oftentimes measure it by, there's one cable box in a household, and then that goes to a certain amount of TVs, so that might give specific numbers. Or even before that, there's only one television in a household, we can measure it. Now, I might have 4 or 5 devices of my own with Netflix on them, and so I'm one person with one account, but I've watched this 3 or 4 different ways on 3 or 4 different devices. And so a lot of times they're measuring that in minutes or in time, or I'm sharing my account with other people or something like that, or a family account. And so the time becomes a big part of it as well these days.
Odell, you also mentioned AI. Now, that's obviously a topic that seems to be permeating every area of life these days, but particularly with regards to this strike, the allegation from the talent, particularly SAG-AFTRA, is that they are being forced or contracted to sign away their image and their likeness and their their IP basically to the studios, who are then able to leverage that and manipulate that for future projects. Not only that, but again, that they are able to use AI to develop content that would otherwise be produced by writers. That's one of the main contentions in the Writers Guild strike, that you no longer will need the talents of writers if you use chat, functions like chat and also AI. So talk to us about those two separate allegations. Are they somewhat interrelated also?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, first from the writer's standpoint, because they've gotten to talk a little bit more about it, because they're the ones who have been at the table more so with the AMPTP. And so the writers, a couple of things that they're generally concerned about is that, what if, the idea being that companies might use generative AI. And so, for instance, maybe a studio generates a script or something like that, and then now they don't need writers to generate the actual script. They just say, we need you to do edits, we need you to ship this around, we need you to punch this up, so to speak, to make it more human, to make it more capable. And then, of course, that will lead to fewer writers and fewer, less income and less of the job, so to speak, to be done there. So that's a big concern for writers, is that they would start, rather than starting with the writers, they would start with something that's AI generated, and then just bring in writers to shift or change that around, which would really undercut their creative expression and the writers. The other side of it, one of the other things that writers are most concerned about is As we understand, generative AI is still a really highly developing field. But one of the things that it really does is that it looks at information that's out there to then create whatever it's creating. And so a lot of writers are concerned about having their work fed into those databases to make generative AI even better. Like if you feed a database a bunch of stuff written by Shonda Rhimes, will it be able to create like Shonda Rhimes scripts or Aaron Sorkin scripts? Like they don't want that to be the case because their writing style is their hallmark. That is their intellectual property. And so protections around is a big sticking point for the writers. And then, like you said, for the actors, same kind of thing. The thing that SAG is most concerned about is that is the idea of using the likeness of an actor, and then, like you said, being able to use that and also generate content that they couldn't otherwise do without the presence of an actor. It's always been a concern to a certain degree. Like I see plenty of agreements where we're really always kind of limiting or concerned with how are we going to use the likeness of this actor. But if it's something more static, there's kind of a built-in limit. Here's some photos that were provided. Here's the movie that it's in. Here's the commercial that it's in. This is the work that's here. And there's a limit on how far you can do that. I can't take someone who's acted in a State Farm commercial and then easily like just superimpose their head onto like a basketball commercial and go, well, there you go. But the idea being that if you scan this likeness and then you're using generative AI, I might be able to create actual scenes and actual content without even having the actor in there. And then the key piece that a lot of the actors are really concerned about is that often the use of a likeness was for that particular use has usually signed for in perpetuity. The idea being that, this movie is going to last forever, so this likeness can continue to be used. That generally has some safety around it, but if we're talking about generative AI, you come to the hypothetical concern that comes for a lot of actors is you come to a job and you're doing it for one thing, but you get scanned there and they go, great, now we're going to use this image or this likeness of you for many jobs thereafter without even including or paying or crediting you for that work. And so the protections that they want against some of those pieces are definitely at issue for the actors.
Well, I know you're a musician too. You worked with a lot of musicians, and you're one yourself, also a producer, creative director. So I want to get your perspective on the music industry as it relates to these issues as well. I mean, we've covered on our podcast some of the issues dealing with AI for sure. There's some early litigation involving AI and copyrighted material on the music side. How do you see these issues playing out in the music industry? Do you see the same things coming up down the road? Understanding that right now the music industry is booming, right? We're coming off the most, successful, or in the middle of some of the most successful tours in history, from Taylor Swift to Beyonce to Ed Sheeran. I mean, they're making a lot of money on the road, so perhaps there's more to go around as opposed to what's happening in TV and film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. We're in this interesting space where there's so much happening in a really great way that's showing this revival, and also this connection to the live experience or various aspects of it that I think from the outside looking in, for anyone, they might see that there is a real passion for music still, and like that connection to it as a real thing. So I think in some ways that adds a little bit of hope that not everything has been moved off of wanting to connect in that human space. But I do think that one of the challenges that will continue to come up here, and it does tend to be the underlying challenge that we see kind of all throughout things of like, what are we defining as authorship? Like, who is the creator of something, and when does that tip over in that regard? There are some aspects of music where this has been touched on to some degree, or at least wrestled with before, where in the sense that when we're creating music and then there are all these different plugins that might be being used to create something, or automations and aspect, like a lot of the techniques that are used to create music are guided by a human, but then they're also tied to some sort of machine. And we have a pretty good sense of like what that means for authorship, that it still doesn't pull that away. So I think just really, what does it mean to hit that line and continue to find the level of authorship? And what is that? Is going to be the challenge. One thing I'd certainly say is that like we've always dealt with this to a certain degree. I don't want to, like make it flippant or whatever, but in the entertainment industry has always struggled with, when there's new technology that comes around, what does it mean for the people who have been creating now and who are going to be creating after? Like, people were so worried that, if you could hear, just when you could hear recorded music at home, with the phonograph. No one was ever going to go to shows again. It was going to replace symphonies. And then when you could have things when radios could come into, your home, then all of a sudden that was going to disconnect people from music, etc. So the wrestling with the technology that is changing is a continuous thing that we've always done. It doesn't make it any, I think the wrestling is important. We always have to do it. But it does give me some hope that we care so much about creative things and that tension, that we do the wrestling as a society and do usually find ways to find a space for the new things that are coming, while also still keeping space for like genuine and authentic expression. So who knows what it looks like? We're chasing it.
Odell, you mentioned this, new interest and thirst for movies and live production. I mean, for music and live productions. It seems that one of the reasons that this strike is prolonging on the film and TV side is that there might be some degree of fatigue of content on that side. I mean, I know personally the pressure that I feel, the stress every time there's a new
Yes.
a new TV show. I can't believe that there's something new that I can add to my ever-growing list. It stresses me the hell out to add something else. And like I know I'm going to get to it, and there'll be something else in a week that Netflix, shows me that I want to watch. So, whereas in the past these strikes have been relatively quick because there wasn't the amount of content out there, especially the inventory. There's a backlog. Now there seems to be a greater, public tolerance for a prolonged strike because you don't need to turn on the TV and watch your content. You got to catch up on, years of stuff anyway. So that seems to be also relevant here, no?
Yeah, it does in multiple ways. So I think you're right. I think that there is a level of saturation that also connects to a level of fatigue. I'm the same way. I've got my list that I look at and I go, oh my gosh, there's all these shows that I want to watch. And then we just get overwhelmed and we go, anyway, I'll just turn on another episode of something I've watched before. Because there's just so many things that I want to see and continuously more than comes out. And I think that that is true of the average person. I think that what we find is, and kind of like you said, that there was a time when the idea of like, all right, we got to get through this strike and get back to work. Well, the work was clear. There were fewer people doing it. There were fewer things happening. Like there was the path toward that was always difficult, but there was a way to get to that a little more express. One could say that the studios are probably leaning on that fatigue and leaning on that backlog to a certain degree because the writers and the actors aren't working except for a few specific situations. But beyond that, by and large, the writers and the actors aren't working. But the studios are still able to live off of the backlog that we have there. I mean, they're absolutely going to see a drop in the revenue and profits and whatnot. But I think about like even 10 years ago, the idea of facing a fall season like we are right now with no new shows on a network and everyone like, and that just going into reruns and like syndication and maybe some reality TV, that would be a real problem. But there's the average person who's like, hey, maybe I might be able to catch up on this and that. And I think they're kind of relying on some of that to, add some of that pressure when things are happening at the table. So there is a higher tolerance for it, I think, for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I agree with that. Last question here on the pod,
Sure.
this pod, Odell. Thank you so much. Some major tentpole productions have been delayed. I mean, the Marvels, Dune 2 has been pushed back. Like you mentioned, the fall slate has been pushed back. That should add a little bit of pressure, but not necessarily enough to end it right now. What's your prediction? Many are saying, we might see this last well into October. What's your prediction as to when this is resolved? And do you see one side or the other? Because, giving in, because so far we've seen a lot of rhetoric on both sides. We've seen a lot of public relations move, which is typical to a labor, issue. But when do you see this resolving?
So I think, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's going to resolve soon. What a broad word, right? Soon. But I'd say some of the pieces that come into it are that right now, the people at the table are the studios and the writers. So they have been back and forth in the negotiations since like May, and that has been slow for the most part. And then the actors haven't even actually been able to sit down at the table with the studios. And so the strikes and the issues are connected. The idea being that once things are resolved for the writers and the studios, they come to some agreement, then it won't be like we're starting at zero once they're sitting down with the actors. Like that will hopefully be a faster process. But we do still have both of those things to get through. Like one strike being over doesn't automatically in the other one. So in that sense, the likelihood that those things unfold really fast are kind of low. Additionally, we've been, the writers have been striking since May, and there have only been a few like official presentations back and forth, and they haven't gone necessarily well. Even just a couple of weeks ago, the studios kind of presented a official counter offer to the writers that the writers did not like. They weren't like, this is great. They largely panned. And then the studios also released that to the public. And that has been widely kind of seen as a tactic to try to get the writers union to turn on itself, to get the rank and file members to see what the counteroffer is and go, hey, this is good enough for us, and then pressure the leadership, which only now that hasn't really happened. They've held strong, but that just slows things down. And as it stands right now, we don't actually have a date when they're supposed to come back to the table. So they haven't really moved forward. We're still in a writer's strike, and they don't even know when they're really coming back to the table. And that's not going well. So I would say I would be surprised. Quite frankly, I would love to be wrong with this one, but I would be surprised if we see everyone back to work before the top of next year, like in a way that we kind of expect. Will these things find themselves in some sort of resolution before the end of the year? Hopefully, but will we be back to kind of things as we would see in Hollywood before the top of the year? I don't know. We're in September. We got one quarter really left. And that would be kind of surprising to see, but I would love to be wrong. I would love it.
And the release of that information to the press, by the way, might be violative of, federal labor laws, might be violative of our NLRB laws. We'll see how that plays out. Odell Mitchell III, thirdinlinelegal.com. What an interesting discussion. Please come back and update our viewers and listeners on this topic as it progresses. Hopefully it'll be done soon, but probably not for a while. So we'll have you back on. And thank you so much for joining us on the SERMAPod.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rich. It's been really wonderful to be here. Thanks, you all. I appreciate it.
Ideas, strategies, and opinions represented on this podcast are those of the speakers and do not represent the ideas, strategies, and opinions of their employers.